Good day. Today is Tuesday, 18th March 2025, and yet again I find myself in the somewhat awkward position of doing a programme just a few hours before an important event is about to take place, the telephone call between American President Donald Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin, an event which might overtake and supersede many of the things that I'm saying in this programme. I should say straight away that I do not know what the content of this conversation is going to be. There is a mass of speculation out there from all sorts of people who claim to know or believe they know what the two men are going to say to each other, but I'm not certain that much of this is based on anything at all. What we do know is this, that Peskov, Putin's spokesman, has said that the discussions will focus on normalization of relations between the United States and Russia, and that they will also address the situation in Ukraine. Peskov has also disclosed that the call took some days to sort out. My understanding is that this was mostly related to timetable issues. 2 hours has been assigned for this call, given that the last telephone conversation between Trump and Putin went on for 90 minutes. 2 hours is perhaps wise, allowing for 2 hours is perhaps wise. And given that both Trump and Putin are extremely busy people, to say the least, it's not surprising that there's had to be some discussion and looking at diaries and all that kind of thing in order to find 2 hours over the course of a week when both men are very busy, 2 hours when they're both free to speak to each other. So we're going to have a call. It may last for 2 hours, it may last longer than that, or it may last for a much shorter period of time. Peskov has said that it will continue for as long as it has to. And that's basically what he said. And he's also said, as I said previously, that they will discuss normalization of relations between Russia and the United States and also the situation in Ukraine. Now, of course, Trump himself has been talking about other things, and it's been also saying his own things. And it's very interesting to contrast the aggressive optimism, the sense of enormous forward motion, the talk that things are moving forward at great speed and that we're about to clinch a deal that's coming from the Americans, from the Trump administration. And by contrast, the entirely characteristic tight-lipped silence that's coming from the Russians. And this is, by the way, very much in the character of the two governments. The United States, all American governments, in my opinion, are always anxious to shape the media space, the information space. It's also, I think, fair to say that Americans tend to think that by talking up a negotiation, by implying that things are close to agreement, that somehow puts pressure on the other side to rush into an agreement. So this is not unusual negotiating style from the United States. I've come across that myself in negotiations that I've seen involving American parties. Whereas the Kremlin, by contrast, highly structured, tightly disciplined, a place which keeps its secrets very well, a place which has organized itself to prevent leaks and has done so very thoroughly, to my knowledge. Well, they are, by contrast, saying as little as they can get away with. And that is entirely in character, and it's, by the way, in character of the two men, the two very different men, Putin and Trump, who are going to speak with each other later today. So I don't think anything should derive from this. It is the case that in advance of the call, each side has taken certain steps which could be seen as conciliatory to the other. The United States has pulled out of an investigation of Russian war crimes or alleged war crimes in the conflict in Ukraine. I understand it was an investigation set up by the Europeans, though clearly the Biden administration was involved, and the Biden administration committed the United States to full participation in this process. Well, the United States has now pulled out, and they will not be involved, presumably, in investigations of Russian war crimes in Ukraine, real or imagined. And as for the Russians, according to the Financial Times, the Russians have allowed some dealing in shares in Russian companies owned by certain American individuals and companies to take place, relaxing restrictions in dealings in those shares, which were announced by President Putin way back in the spring of 2022. It's a rather arcane step, one which benefits only a few individuals in the United States. It's very typical sort of Russian move. It doesn't really amount to very much. Again, as I said, the Russians like to measure their moves extremely carefully. But for the moment, at least, they're not prepared to make big, bold gestures. They might do after today, we'll see. But before the conversation, they've just taken these small steps to try to signal to the Americans that, yes, they are willing to talk and to take things forward and to normalize relations in the way that Peskov says is one of the things that the Americans and the Russians are going to talk about, Putin and Trump are going to talk about this afternoon. Now, there has been a lot more speculation, a lot of it in the Western media, talking about things like Donald Trump deciding to recognize Crimea as part of Russia. There's a report in the New York Times that Trump is looking to hand over the port city of Odessa to Russia, that he apparently recognizes how important Odessa is to the Russians, and he's prepared to hand it over to the Russians. There's apparently alarm and worry about that in Kiev, which, by the way, if true, suggests that the Ukrainians have not been very carefully briefed about this discussion between Putin and Trump. Anyway, there's an awful lot of that going on, and it's difficult to know how much reality there is to all of this. It derives from Trump's comment made yesterday that when discussing the settlement in Ukraine, Trump is going to talk about Black Sea ports and power stations. And it's likely that in the discussions that have already taken place between the Russians and the Americans, between Ushakov and Witkoff, especially those that took place on Wednesday night, on Thursday night, the Russians will have pointed out the importance of Odessa to themselves. They'll have highlighted the decision of the European Court of Human Rights about the Odessa fire in May 2014, the fact that Ukraine, a decision has been made by the European Court of Human Rights condemning Ukraine for its mishandling of that fire. I should say, by the way, that that decision falls far short of attributing criminal motives on the Ukrainian authorities. It seems to me, having read the decision, to be more a case of putting blame for the escalation of events on both sides, but conceding that the Ukrainian authorities failed in taking necessary steps to prevent the situation escalating, or indeed to prevent lives from being lost. As I said, I don't myself think that it is a decision that really lives up to some of the commentary I've seen about it. But anyway, it could be that the Russians brought all that up in their discussions with Witkoff on Thursday, who's to say? But one way or the other, it's likely that the reference to Black Sea ports that Witkoff and Trump have made really does refer to Odessa in some ways. And of course, they've also brought up the question of the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. I presume that is what power plants mean, which presumably has been brought up by the Ukrainians. There are, of course, alternative interpretations to these words. They're very vague. It could be that when Trump talks about power plants, he's talking about the Russian missile strikes on the Ukrainian power plants, not just nuclear power plants. In fact, the Russians have never attacked nuclear power plants. But he might be discussing the attacks on the Ukrainian energy system, which, by the way, continued yesterday. Or it could be that when he's talking about the Black Sea ports, he's talking about allowing uninterrupted traffic from the Black Sea ports. As I said, people may be reading far too much into these words. And I think there's a lot of speculation, and most of it is based on people's own interpretation of Trump's perspectives on this conflict and what he wants to achieve. On the Russian side, by the way, there are also serious concerns. Those people who are deeply committed to the war, who want to see every single objective set out in the special military operation. They're very worried that Putin is going to sell out in some way, that he's going to go for a Minsk III. I've had emails from people making that claim, including from Russians. And given the history, I can understand why. I don't think myself that that is what's going to happen. And I've not seen any suggestion from the Kremlin that that is going to happen so far. In fact, Ushakov, who will no doubt be listening in on the call alongside Putin, has said that he personally is skeptical that the Ukrainians have any genuine interest in peace. He's pointed out that as soon as Ukraine agreed to the 30-day ceasefire that Trump is talking about, the Ukrainians carried out their biggest ever drone strike against Russia, which is hardly consistent with them seriously desiring peace. He says that the Russians are still prepared to discuss negotiations, but he seemed very guarded about that in what he said. Now, I think before we proceed further, there's a number of points to make. Firstly, I am not actually sure how much actual communication, how much actual discussion there has been between the United States and Russia on the Ukraine question up to this point. What we know is that Putin and Trump held a telephone call with each other in February, telephone call which lasted 90 minutes, a call, by the way, in which Putin conceded nothing. He made very clear that for him, the settlement had to address what he called the root causes of the conflict. I've already explained what that means. So we had one long telephone call back in February. Then there was a follow-up meeting in Riyadh, which Lavrov and Ushakov attended, and where they met with Rubio, Waltz, and Witkoff. And that discussion seems to have covered many, many different topics. It seems to have been heavily focused on re-establishing diplomatic contacts, and we were told at the time by both sides that it was basically, on the question of Ukraine, it was basically limited to the United States appointing a contact person, a negotiator, and that the Russians said that when they knew who that person was, they would do the same. And it's clear since then that the negotiator is Witkoff and his counterpart is Ushakov. So that was, as far as I can see, all that came out of Riyadh in terms of in terms of the Ukraine discussions about settling the conflict in Ukraine. Then there was another follow-up meeting, this time in Istanbul, but this was exclusively on the technical questions of unblocking the American and Russian embassies in respectively Moscow and Washington. That was apparently a tough discussion. Ambassador Polyansky, who is the deputy head of mission, Russia's mission to the United Nations Security Council, on Friday told Glenn Deason and myself that the discussions did make some progress. They were purely about technical issues, and that the Russians found that the people they were talking to, the American officials they were talking to, were long-standing members of the State Department, the same people who used to work for the Blinken-headed State Department in Joe Biden's time. So there was no change of guard there, even though some progress was made. And then after the meeting between the Americans and the Ukrainians in Jeddah, Witkoff came to Moscow. He had several hours of talks with various people there. He met with Putin himself. We don't know how long the meeting with Putin was, but I'm starting to get the sense that it was not very long. Putin apparently gave him a message to pass on to Trump. This message presumably would have been one which made the same points that Putin made over the course of his press conference, the one with Lukashenko that I've discussed so extensively, the one in which he discussed the nuances that concerned him about the 30-day ceasefire proposal, and the one in which he talked about the need to address the root causes of the conflict. And then Witkoff, who'd already had talks with Ushakov, talks which suggest that the Russians had not, certainly at that time, well, based on what Ushakov has told us, had not made any substantive or major shifts in their position. Anyway, Witkoff listened to what the Russians had to say, listened to what Ushakov said, took this message with him from Putin. I presume, by the way, that this is a written message, an actual letter, and passed on this message to Trump. And Trump apparently was pleased enough with what he found in this message, as he seems, by the way, to have been pleased with what he heard Putin say over the course of the news conference. And that then led to the discussions between the Kremlin and the White House to set up the telephone call between Putin and Trump, which Putin said should happen in his Thursday press conference. Now, that does not seem to me to suggest very intense degree of diplomatic interaction between the two countries. Basically, it amounts to two substantive meetings or discussions on the Ukrainian issue, one by Trump and Putin in February during their telephone call, but that can only have touched on Ukraine. for a relatively short period of time, given that they only spoke for 90 minutes, and rather more extensive discussions that were held with Witkoff on Thursday. Now, there may have been other discussions that I don't know about, but it seems so far that Waltz himself, for example, has not called and spoken to his counterparts in Moscow. Lavrov and Rubio did have a call recently, the day before yesterday, in fact, but that seems to have been mostly related to the deteriorating situation in the Middle East, to the attacks by the United States on the Houthi militia in Yemen, and perhaps the situation in Syria. Now, importantly, when we spoke to Ambassador Polyansky on Friday, Ambassador Polyansky told Glenn Deason and myself that still to this day, contacts between the Russian mission at the United Nations and the American mission is still fairly limited. It's still the old team appointed by Biden, Elise Stefanik, President Trump's pick for US ambassador to the UN, has not yet received confirmation from the Senate, so she's still waiting to be confirmed. So, for the moment at least, the interaction between the Americans and the Russians at the UN continues to be relatively fragmentary and limited, mostly focusing on the situation in the Middle East, though they were able to work together, obviously, at the United Nations to get a resolution passed through the Security Council on Ukraine, in which drawn up by the United States, and which did not make criticisms of Russia. Now, I'm saying all of this, I'm outlining all of this because, as everyone concedes, this is a very complicated topic. The conflict in Ukraine is a very complicated topic. Putin himself said so at the Security Council meeting. I'm talking about the Russian Security Council meeting on Friday. He talked about how sorting out relations with the United States and undoing the damage done by the Biden administration, and by the way, before that, by the Obama administration, and by the deep state and the neocons and all of those people during Donald Trump's first administration. Reversing all that damage is going to take a very long time and is going to be very complicated indeed. And the Ukraine conflict itself, well, in some ways, maybe it's not quite as complicated, but there are still issues to discuss, as there are issues to discuss about any possible ceasefire. So, logically, what we will probably have from this meeting today, I would have thought, given that substantive contacts between the Americans and the Russians so far has been relatively sparse, is Putin and Trump bouncing ideas off each other about how the ceasefire can be made to work, talking about the substantive issues, the ultimate peace agreement, which Putin continues to say has to be an essential part of any discussions between the Americans and the Russians. Any ceasefire must ultimately lead to that peace agreement. Anyway, I would have thought that they will be bouncing ideas off each other. They could conceivably agree to a committee of experts, another further meeting between Witkoff and Ushakov a one-to-one meeting, maybe in Saudi Arabia, this time with proper delegations, proper expert teams participating to take this whole process forward, the Ukraine process forward, perhaps a separate meeting in parallel to discuss normalization of relations between the United States, and all of this preparatory to a actual summit meeting between Trump and Putin may be happening in Saudi Arabia over the course of the next few weeks, perhaps this month, a summit meeting where maybe, just maybe, we could have a framework agreement on Ukraine and perhaps a ceasefire, or more properly, a cessation of hostilities agreed. Now, I have to say, saying all of this, this is all what I would expect. This is logical negotiating. This is how negotiations are normally conducted. The wild card in all of this is the extraordinary personality of Donald Trump and his urgency to get an agreement signed and concluded as soon as possible. So it's possible that over the course of today's call, Trump will push Putin to try to get Putin to agree to a ceasefire now. It could be that this rather structured approach to negotiations, which is the one I am used to and familiar with, and the one that I see is the pattern in other negotiations, other diplomatic negotiations, especially negotiations between superpowers. It could be that Trump says, I'm not interested in any of that. I want a deal done now. I want it as soon as possible. I need a decision, a concrete decision about a ceasefire today. I don't know how the Russians will react to that. Maybe they're ready for it. Maybe they've been prepared for it by Wickoff. So we'll see. As I said, I want to stress again that I don't know how the negotiations, the discussions, the telephone call this afternoon, is going to go. But to repeat again, I would have thought that this more structured process, which would still be by the standards of diplomatic discussions, a rapid process, would be a more likely way forward. And I find it very difficult to believe that Donald Trump is going to do some of the radical things that people say, like come out of the meeting, announce that sanctions against Russia are lifted, or alternatively, announce that sanctions against Russia are increased because he's very unhappy about the fact that Putin isn't agreeing to everything that he says, or to announce that he recognizes Crimea as part of Russia, or that he's going to transfer Odessa to Russia. I find it very difficult to believe that Donald Trump, at this very early stage in the discussions, is going to do anything of that kind. So, anyway, we will see what happens. It's important to say again that in terms of the negotiations that are taking place at the moment, we have a team of consummate professionals. Putin, Ushakov, Lavrov, all of the others are professionals to their fingertips. They've been doing this sort of thing for decades, whereas Trump and Waltz are amateurs. In saying this, let me repeat again, I mean absolutely no disrespect. I'm not suggesting that these are extremely clever and talented people. It's just that they haven't done much of, well, anything like this before at any point in their careers. Wickoff, until a few weeks ago, was somebody who made a big fortune out of real estate and construction deals in New York. He's very familiar, no doubt, with commercial negotiations, but he's never been up against a team like the Russians before. And the same, by the way, can be said about Donald Trump. Obviously, Trump has been president before, but he's never been able to negotiate with the Russians. He was prevented from negotiating with the Russians during his first term for the reasons that we all know. So we're dealing with a negotiation of professionals against amateurs. Logically, that should give the professionals the advantage. And if you look at much of the media coverage, that is what many people in the West are worried about. But again, as somebody who was once a professional myself, I would say that coming up against an amateur can present all kinds of challenges, and there's no knowing in advance of how that's all going to turn out. I'm going to come back to what I think. I think that Putin will tell Trump, will reassure Trump that the Russians are indeed interested in negotiations. That's what Ushakov has just said. He complains about the Ukrainian drone attack on Russia, but he says Russia continues to be interested in negotiations. I think the Russians will try to reassure the Americans that they are interested in a deal. I've said many times why. They want to avoid the trap that Eve Smith has talked about many times in many articles, a trap where they find themselves in control of the whole of Ukraine and, as a result, in indefinite conflict with the West and the United States, which doesn't provide them with the security of their western borders that they seek. So I think the Russians want negotiations. They're going to try to assure the Americans of this. And they're going to say to the Americans, look, if we want to take this step by step, it's not because we're playing for time. It's not because we want to spin this out. On the contrary, when negotiations over Ukraine have been spun out, it's always been by the Ukrainians and your friends in Europe, never by us. The Russians are going to try to explain all of that to the Americans and say that whilst they want to move quickly, they do want this thing to be done step by step, because there are not a lot of complicated and involved issues to work through. Now, unspoken in these discussions, unless, of course, the Americans are unwise enough to bring this topic up, will be the question of leverage. Now, there continues to be a widespread view in many places in the West that the United States possesses huge leverage over Russia. Trump has talked about more sanctions on the Russians if they don't do what he wants them to do. And more people can talk about, there's been much talk about the United States stepping up its assistance to Ukraine, though nobody explains how exactly that is supposed to happen. Now, on this, let me repeat again. I've said this many times. The United States cannot impose more sanctions against Russia without doing much more significant damage to itself, to the United States and its economy, and to the European and Western economies as well. Any further sanctions, for example, trying to restrict exports of Russian oil, will cause problems for the United States with some of its friends, India, for example, and is likely to be ignored and disregarded by China, with whom the Russians are in continuous contact. And again, To remind everyone, the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman recently warned the United States that China is prepared for tariff wars, trade wars, any kind of war that the United States imposes on it, and that it will see that sort of war through to its end. That is what the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman said. So if the United States starts imposing secondary sanctions on China because China continues to import Russian oil, the Chinese will retaliate in kind, and that will simply escalate the current economic problems we already see in the United States, in Europe, which already are very grave indeed. So the United States really doesn't have the sanctions weapons against Russia that some people seem to think it does. To repeat again a point made by Ian Proud, the British diplomat, who we've been honoured to interview several times on the Duran, Russia's economy is growing. Europe's economies are contracting. The United States has its share of economic problems. Yes, Russia does have issues in its economy, though they have different causes and explanations to those that many think. Russia, by the way, has taken steps to bring those problems under control, and I predict that it will succeed in doing so. Sanctions are not going to knock the Russian economy out of contention. They're going to make the Russians simply dig in, and they're going to backfire on the United States. As for stepping up military and other supplies to Ukraine, that is a path to nowhere. The Russians have just won a clear-cut victory in Kursk. There's been a long discussion about the victory in Kursk that I've just been reading. I was reading shortly on one of the Russian Telegram channels. Most enlightening. You can find a brief summary of it on Slavyangrad. Now, briefly, what it says is this, that obviously this war has been a learning curve for the Russians. They went into the war unfamiliar with many of the new technologies that one sees in modern war, and they had at the beginning issues of command and control, of integrating different branches of the armed forces, of making all of the various parts of the military machine play and work together in unison and at the same time. In other words, combined arms, but combined arms in a modern sense, not the kind of combined arms that we see people talk about in the West, which still lives in the mental universe created by the Second World War. The idea of moving tank and armoured columns and carrying out blitzkrieg attacks and all of that kind of thing. In the type of war that has evolved today, as the complete failure of Ukraine's 2023 offensive should have shown, that kind of combined arms no longer works against a peer adversary. The true combined arms is one in which the traditional weapons of war, infantry, tanks, armoured vehicles, artillery, air power, are coordinated with the modern fields of war. Electronic jamming, signals disruptions, robots. Robots are now a key part of modern war. And this commentary said that the Russians finally, in the Kursk operation, brought all of that to perfection. They were able to coordinate their robots, their drones, their surveillance drones, their FPV drones, all of their various different types of drones. And this article made the point that the Russians now use many different types of drones over the battlefronts. They have all sorts of types of surveillance drones. They have various different types of FPV drones. They have drones that work with radio signals, other drones that work with fiber optics. The Ukrainians have never, by the way, successfully managed to duplicate the latter. And the Russians were able to coordinate and bring together and create a team on a large scale out of all of these different systems. And the result was not just the complete collapse of the Ukrainian defenses in Kursk region, but the creation of a cauldron for the Ukrainian troops in Kursk region. A cauldron basically manned by robots. It was the drones operating over the roads, operating over the escape routes, that trapped the Ukrainians, inflicted massive devastation and damage upon them, which led to the enormous operational crisis that the Ukrainians suffered in Kursk region and which led to their defeat. So, in that kind of situation, given that the Russians have brought everything in terms of military technology and military expertise, and given that their army continues to grow in size and continues to re-equip, and there's been more reports about how the Russians are building up tank production and every other type of production, it is not possible either for the United States, which is already experiencing depletion in its arsenals, to supply the Ukrainians with enough weapons and material to hold back against this Russian army that is well trained, well equipped, and has now mastered the intricacies of modern war to an extent that no other army in the world currently has done. Now, interestingly, there are the first admissions in the media in the West that finally admit the lack of leverage that the United States currently has over Russia. Take these comments that have appeared in an article in the Times, the London Times, not to be confused with the Financial Times. This is the London Times. Trump has said that he could cause Russia devastating economic pain if Moscow refuses to agree to the ceasefire deal. However, he has not provided details of how he would achieve this, and some analysts have said there is little that Trump can realistically do to force Putin to peace. Russia is already the most sanctioned country, and its economy has performed far better than most Western analysts predicted at the start of its invasion in 2022. Kirill Martynov, the editor of Novaya Gazeta Europe, a Russian opposition news website, said, and this is a quote, "For some reason it is believed that Trump has some kind of magic button with which he can threaten Putin, and that by pressing it he can scare Putin and make him accept his conditions. In fact, Trump has two options: either agree to some of Putin's conditions and engage in something more pleasant in US-Russian relations, or return to the Biden administration strategy, sanctions and weapons, which is we've all seen fail, which he is unlikely to want to do." And he said this in an interview on Drozh TV, an independent Russian television station that has been banned by Moscow. Now, that was published in the London Times, and the title of the article, which is by Mark Bennett, by the way, is "How Trump Could Approach Crucial Ceasefire Talks with Putin and it appeared yesterday. There have been similar comments made in the Financial Times about how Trump, the United States, really doesn't have the leverage to coerce the Russians into concessions. It can offer carrots, but by this point in the conflict, it is out of sticks. And I think that is absolutely true. Now, let's move on and discuss the way in which all of this is being seen around the world, specifically and firstly in Ukraine itself. Now, it does seem that in Ukraine they're becoming increasingly alarmed about the fact that the Americans and the Russians are talking to each other about Trump's discussions with Putin. And there is concern that Trump is going to make some of these radical concessions that people are talking about to Putin. Though, as I've said already, I think those concerns are misplaced. However, one thing which I think the Russians and the Americans do agree with is that one individual is causing enormous problems, and that if there is going to be a successful negotiation, in the end, he has to be removed from the scene and replaced with someone far more amenable. And that is, of course, Vladimir Zelensky. Putin, of course, has gone much further than that. He has said that he doesn't believe that Zelensky is a constitutional or legitimate president of Ukraine. He says that though he's prepared to negotiate with Zelensky, accepting that Zelensky is the person in place, he has very serious doubts whether any settlement document that Zelensky signed has carries any legal force, and if it doesn't carry any legal force, then it's perfectly possible that one day the Ukrainians will go back on it. So Putin has expressed those concerns. He clearly doesn't trust Zelensky. He's been through the whole complex business of trying to negotiate with Zelensky. He met with Zelensky in 2019. Apparently the meeting did not go well. Zelensky tried to persuade Putin to negotiate directly with him and to forget about the Minsk agreement, which required Ukraine to negotiate with the leaders of the two People's Republics of Donbass. And Putin apparently left the meeting deeply angered. Putin also went very far to negotiate with Zelensky in the spring of 2022. The outcome was the Istanbul Agreement. And here, by the way, I ought to say that Jeff Roberts has provided me with extracts, and I stress extracts, of the Istanbul Agreement previously published in the New York Times. And I have seen those extracts already, but I'm going to say straight away that those extracts, in my opinion, are incomplete. I believe, because Ukrainian officials have said so, that there were many more provisions than that. There were a whole series of appendixes and annexes. Apparently the agreement, or rather I should say the draft agreement, was very long, and the New York Times has never published the entirety of it. So there were still unresolved questions about the boundaries, for example, of the Donetsk republics. The Ukrainians were still unwilling to make substantive concessions about those, though they were prepared to agree on many points. But I recall clearly, and I remember also that the Russians have several times referred to the fact that Ukraine did make significant concessions, for example, on the size of its armed forces, on the rights of Russian speakers in Ukraine, things of that kind. And the full details of all of that have never been published. I've never seen the complete document that came out of Istanbul, which I understand ran to well in excess of 100 pages. Just saying. So anyway, that's for the record. Just to say again, there are the Ukrainians, Putin rather, has had experience of negotiating with Zelensky. He thought he had a framework deal with Zelensky in April 2022. Zelensky, under the pressure of the Americans and the British, walked away from it. The Russians, however, have increasingly come to the view, about which they may be right, that Zelensky was not really serious about the negotiations, that he was stringing them along to give Ukraine time to complete its mobilization and to persuade the Russians to withdraw their forces from outside Kiev. And of course, Zelensky, after that, went ahead and issued his decree, his 2nd October 2022 decree, prohibiting negotiations with the Russians, which, by the way, as of the making of this video, he still refuses to reverse. So the Russians are fed up with Zelensky. They don't believe that he's ever going to negotiate peace. They remember his wild talk about Ukraine acquiring nuclear weapons and all of those things. They don't believe that he is sincere about negotiating with them, and they clearly want to see him go. And I think that the Americans, having interacted with Zelensky extensively since before Trump's inauguration, have gradually come to the same view. There is an article today in The Economist which says that Trump dislikes Ukraine, and that basically means, as far as I can see, that Trump dislikes Zelensky himself. So the Americans and the Russians, for different reasons, want to see Zelensky go. The Russians find him an impossible negotiator. The Americans met with Zelensky in the Oval Office. Trump and Vance did. They saw how he behaved there. They're furious about that. They're still furious about that. They also do not believe that negotiations involving Zelensky are going to lead anywhere in the end. So they both want to find some way to remove Zelensky from his position. Now, this is being picked up in Kiev. I've already said that Zelensky, I've said in many programs, that Zelensky now is very deeply embedded in Ukrainian institutions and in the Maidan regime system. The American analyst Gordon Hahn has said the same thing, and he's gone into this in much more detail than I have done. So, leveraging Zelensky out of power is going to be an extremely complex operation if it is going to be done at all. But as I said, I think both the Americans and the Russians agree that that has to happen in some way and at some time. Though, to say it clearly, I don't believe this is going to be talked about or discussed in this call between Putin and Trump, which is coming. I say that because calls like that are normally recorded. If there isn't a recording of the call itself, there will be detailed notes made, and I don't think that it will be a good look for Donald Trump if he appears to be talking with Putin about who will lead Ukraine in future. It's the sort of thing that Ushakov and Witkoff might discuss with each other, probably in private discussions without note takers present. Bear in mind that Ushakov speaks fluent English, so he can talk with Witkoff and they can talk to each other about these matters without the need for interpreters. Just saying. But I don't think it's something that Trump and Putin are going to talk about when they speak to each other this afternoon. However, in Ukraine itself, people are discussing this, and we've had a long article about this in the Financial Times. Now, this article in the Financial Times, which came out a few days ago, purportedly discusses whether Ukraine can continue to fight Russia if the United States finally and comprehensively ends its intelligence and military support. Now, I'm not going to waste time with that part of the article. The article says, with little conviction, that it can keep going, Ukraine can keep going for perhaps 6 months. I personally think that most unlikely. That's my own view. But the article ultimately does concede that however long it takes, without the help of the United States, Ukraine itself is doomed. Now, Zelensky discovered that for himself after the altercation with Trump and Vance in the Oval Office. He met with the European leaders. He went to Starmer's summit meeting in London, in Lancaster House. He met with the European leaders. He was hugged by Starmer outside Downing Street. He met with other European leaders as well. They all told him how fervently they continue to support him. They all made all kinds of promises. But when unpacked, those promises in the end amounted to nothing at all. The Europeans are not in a position to replace the Americans, and the Ukrainians obviously cannot continue to fight the Russians on the basis of their own resources. There has been a very interesting interview in Strana between Colonel Reisner of the Austrian army and Strana. This has been translated for me again by Jeff Roberts. It's extremely interesting reading. Reisner makes many of the same points that I've made in previous programs. He speaks about how this is a war of attrition. Ukraine has been fighting a war of attrition against a far more powerful adversary. Even with Western support, Ukraine has gradually been ground down by this war of attrition. And Reisner makes the point that I've made many times in many programs, that in wars of attrition, when the collapse comes, when the final collapse of the weaker party comes, it comes suddenly, and when it happens, it is total. Reisner says that the risk Ukraine runs is that if there is a military collapse, we are no longer going to see this situation where the Russians advance incrementally, taking one town or village at a time, though in fact that's hardly the case anymore. The Russians have been advancing significantly more quickly over the course of the last year. But anyway, at that point, when the collapse comes, the Russians will be able to move much faster than they have done at any point previously in the war. You could have Russian armored columns advancing at 20 kilometers a day, or things like that, even faster maybe, just as happened in the last months of the Second World War, when the German front lines started to crumble or began to crumble. So, Ukraine doesn't have the ability to keep fighting for much longer. 6 months may be optimistic. If the Americans withhold support, then a collapse in Ukraine, a military collapse, is almost certain. But the main point about this Financial Times article, at least the part of it that interested me, is what it said about the internal situation in Kiev. And bear in mind, this is written in the Financial Times, which has up to now been the most supportive newspaper in Britain, bar none, supportive of the personality of Vladimir Zelensky himself. It says this: Ukrainians have rallied around their president since his clash with Trump, and his ratings, which have steadily waned throughout the war, have risen. I didn't vote for him, says Pavlo, a combat medic, but I'll support him as long as the war continues. We can laugh at him, but it's not okay for outsiders to do so. And then we come to the rub. Still, there is incipient speculation in Kiev's political circles over how long Zelensky will stay in office. We are in the final act of Zelensky's presidency, says a senior Ukrainian official, and the hot phase of the war. So the war is coming to an end, and so is Zelensky himself. Political opponents in Kiev who threw their support behind Zelensky publicly after the Oval Office fiasco are in reality preparing for elections, forming alliances and testing public messaging. Some opposition politicians have started outreach to the Trump administration and the US president's MAGA allies in Washington, including attending a prayer breakfast in the United States. I believe this refers to Tymoshenko, but I'm not sure. The military governor of Kiev, Timur Tkachenko, a Zelensky appointee, says everyone in Ukraine wants elections, but only after the war. Fight, win elections, he adds, which is absurd at this point. Klimenko, the opposition MP, while critical of the government's record in tackling corruption in parts of the public sector, says it would be impossible to hold an election until the end of the war. She highlights the logistical complexity of organising a vote when up to 7 million Ukrainians have left the country and nearly a million are in uniform. But behind the scenes, politics is intensifying and becoming more virulent. When Zelensky last month put sanctions on his predecessor and opposition leader, Petro Poroshenko, it was widely seen as politically motivated by some opposition parties. Volodymyr Ariel, a close ally of Poroshenko, says that far from becoming a new Winston Churchill, Zelensky has failed to unite the nation. Simply put, Zelensky has not become a true leader, he says. He is unable to adapt to the challenges Ukraine faces today. He remains selfish, narcissistic, and arrogant in his dealings both within Ukraine and with international partners. That's the first time, by the way, that I've seen Zelensky described like that in the Financial Times. But anyway, moving on. The Trump administration has made no secret of its desire to work with the new Ukrainian leader. And then there's talk about Zelensky, but then we're told that Zelensky might not be the more amenable president that Washington is seeking. So there we are. The pot in Kiev has been stirred. It's not clear that this is indeed going to lead to a change of government. Zelensky's fall. At any point within the next few weeks. As I said, his position in Ukraine continues to be strong. The Europeans continue to back him. But ultimately, that is both what the Russians and the Americans want. And we see that within Kiev itself, there is a political ferment starting to take hold. So, this is basically all I am able to say for the moment about the state of the discussions between Trump and Putin. The Russians and the Americans are both saying that they will provide detailed accounts of the discussion after it takes place. The Russians are saying that they might not just provide a readout, which is what they always do, but there might even be a briefing as well, which is very interesting. And it may suggest that the Russians are becoming concerned that the Americans are basically, in narrative terms, running the show, and that they want to balance any American briefing with a briefing of their own. Just saying. Be interesting to see who conducts the briefing. I'm going to guess it will be Ushakov. I remember back in 2021, 2022, after the discussions between Putin and Biden, it was Ushakov who conducted the briefings for the Russians. So anyway, we will see what comes. But as I said, to repeat again, I suspect that we will get some movement towards setting up expert groups to try to iron out the nuances that Putin identified in the ceasefire proposal. I expect that Putin will push for Trump to move towards a final settlement on the Ukrainian conflict, one which addresses the root causes of the conflict, as Putin repeatedly says. I think he will find, by the way, a willing partner from Trump on this. I think Trump also wants a final agreement. He does not, it seems to me, want protracted negotiations. Everything that he has said up to now argues against him wanting this. And I expect that there will also be an agreement that Putin and Trump will meet with each other probably within the next couple of weeks, perhaps this month, perhaps more plausibly next month, most probably in Saudi Arabia. And as I discussed in a recent program, the fact that Putin spoke to MBS, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, directly after his press conference and before his meeting with Witkoff, strongly suggests to me that Putin is already thinking about a summit meeting with Trump in Saudi Arabia, and was basically asking MBS whether MBS can take care of the preparations. So that is where I think we're going. In a few hours' time, probably by the time you're watching this program, you will know a great deal more about it than me. So let's now talk about other things. Now, since I began with the situation in Ukraine, since I've been discussing the situation with Ukraine, I think it's only proper if I first talk a little bit more about the military situation over the last couple of hours. The first is that it appears that there is still a significant number of Ukrainian troops tied up, basically encircled, in the small area of Kursk region where they are still located. This is Haredovka, Russian newspaper, as I've described many times, media website based in the Russian city of Smolensk. It's very strongly patriotic, nationalist. It supports the special military operation. Anyway, this is what it says about the ongoing military situation in Kursk. Obviously, this is their account. I can't corroborate it, but I have in the past found Redovka reliable. The remnants of the Ukrainian Armed Forces group in the Kursk border area are bleeding in a small patch without the ability to quickly leave their positions and retreat, since they will be killed on the march. An unknown number of Ukrainian soldiers and foreign fighters are surrounded in the fields and forest plantations southwest of Suja. So that seems to be the situation currently in Kursk region. Abdi Alodinov, the head of the Akhmat Special Forces unit, has said that practically all of Kursk region has now been brought under Russian control. So that's an update about the situation there. Now, perhaps because the Ukrainians lost their bridgehead in Kursk region, but perhaps because Zelensky still clings to the idea that he can barter Russian territory for Ukrainian territory or former Ukrainian territory in future negotiations. It seems that over the last 24 hours, the Ukrainians made another attempt to try to enter Belgorod region in Russia and perhaps to seize a village there. The attack, however, which is a fairly small, a company of soldiers supported by engineering vehicles and a tank, again taking this from Redovka, it's about 100 men altogether. It seems that they have been repelled. Again, this is what Redovka says about this. The enemy, which is to say the Ukrainians, attempted to break through the border with a force of up to a company of soldiers, supported by engineering vehicles and a tank. Fighting with the enemies underway in the area of the villages of Grafovka, Demidovka and Prilezye. The attempt to break in and consolidate their positions in populated areas has failed. So that's Redovka's account. As I say, it's entirely predictable, very much the kind of thing you would expect Zelensky to think of. His forces have been driven out of Kursk region. They suffered a catastrophic defeat there. He's very short of men and reserves, so he's launched an attack with a small force into Belgorod region, attempting to capture some Russian villages there in order to try to make up the loss in his bargaining position, as he believes, except, of course, that the attack has miscarried. Well, this is a sideshow. Elsewhere, news is a great deal more dramatic, but the big news over the last 24 hours has been of a major Russian advance in Zaporozhye region. This is in the south, close to Crimea and the Black Sea. It's the same area where Ukraine launched its 2023 offensive. The reports say that the Russians have advanced northwards, that they've captured various villages, including another village called Stapovoye, from what I can see. And they appear to be moving closer to the town of Orekhov, the launch point of Ukraine's 2023 offensive, and a town which the Russians would want to capture if their ultimate objective was the city of Zaporozhye on the Dnieper River. So there's also been reports of Russian advances in all sorts of other places along the contact line, but I think I'm going to skip that for further discussion on another day. The big news that's coming out today is of a dramatic escalation, I should say deterioration of the situation in the Middle East. It began with American airstrikes on the positions of the Houthi militia in Yemen. Donald Trump has written some ferocious posts on Truth Social, criticizing Joe Biden for weakness in his handling of the Houthis. And there's even some talk of an American ground operation being conducted in Yemen against the Houthis. Now, I ought to say that attacks on the Houthis have taken place on many occasions. The Saudis conducted an entire war against them. They're very strongly entrenched in Yemen. They are by now extremely tough and experienced and disciplined fighters. I would not have thought it was a good idea to take them on in ground battles. Just saying. And as with these airstrikes, I don't think that they're going to make any fundamental difference. There have been many airstrikes against the Houthis. Yemen, I should say, is an extremely rugged, very mountainous country, a place rather like Afghanistan in some ways, where airstrikes can have only a limited effectiveness. I think this whole operation is an act of folly. And apparently it began when the Houthis claimed, probably correctly, that the Israelis were again placing restrictions on humanitarian assistance to people in Gaza. I say probably correctly. I know there will be many people who will say that this is untrue. But anyway, the Houthis started conducting missile strikes on Israel again. This appears to have set in train this process of escalation, and this has resulted in these airstrikes on the Houthis in Yemen. I have to say, I think this is a mistake, but it has led to the other event, and I'm sure that these two events are connected, which is the collapse of the ceasefire in Gaza. I say the collapse of the ceasefire in Gaza. Technically, I understand that the ceasefire has run its course. At least the first phase of the ceasefire has run its course. The Israelis are complaining that the Hamas militia is dragging its heels on releasing hostages. That's not impossible. Anyway, the Israelis have countered by resuming massive airstrikes against Hamas in Gaza, and in the Middle East. The collapse of the ceasefire is being linked to the start of phase two of the ceasefire that had supposedly been originally agreed, which would have required Israeli troops to withdraw from Gaza, something which I think Netanyahu, Prime Minister Netanyahu, absolutely did not want to do, which would have been immensely difficult politically for him. And all of this is happening with rhetoric escalating, criticisms of Iran in particular, growing both in Israel and in the United States and on the part of the Trump administration. So how have we got here? Now, there is inevitably going to be a view that the Gaza ceasefire was never very real, that when Trump spoke about the fact that he wanted ultimately a deal with Iran and wanted to avoid an all-out conflict with Iran, he was probably dissembling. He wasn't telling the truth. There will be those claims. But that then begs the question of why did Trump and Witkoff negotiate a ceasefire in Gaza in the first place? I mean, if they really did want to target Iran, why didn't they just go ahead and target Iran in the way that the Iranians apparently were lobbying for? It seems to me that a more sensible explanation, an explanation that is closer to the facts, is to say that because Witkoff, who was Trump's very effective envoy in the Middle East, has basically stopped focusing on the Middle East, but has been instead dealing with the Russians, negotiating with the Russians over Ukraine. And because Trump's own focus over the last few weeks has been almost obsessively with the Russians, the situation in the Middle East was allowed to basically look after itself. And bear in mind that the administration is full of people who take very strong pro-Israeli positions and who are most unwilling to cut Iran any slack. Now, I suspect that this is what has led us here. If Witkoff had been according all his time to the Middle East, if he'd been shuttling between Doha, where Hamas is, and Cairo and Jerusalem, perhaps, just possibly, the situation would have been kept under control. But Witkoff has not been doing that. He's instead been focusing on Russia. He's been meeting with Putin in Moscow and conducting negotiations with the Russians in Riyadh and doing all of those things. Now, saying that all of this has happened because Trump and Witkoff were distracted and took their eye off the ball in the Middle East is in no way to excuse Donald Trump. On the contrary, it shows that Donald Trump has fallen into exactly that trap that we on the Duran, Alex Christoforou and I, repeatedly warned him against. That instead of simply making a clean break with Ukraine as soon as he became president, he's immersed himself in negotiations to try to settle the situation in Ukraine. This is taking up an enormous amount of his time. It's taken over Witkoff's time completely. That was completely predictable. On the Duran, we predicted it. Steve Bannon, his former political advisor, predicted that it would happen as well. And the result is that the situation in the Middle East, which he tried to pacify in the first weeks of his presidency, is now once again spiraling out of control. To repeat again, Donald Trump is trying to do, in my opinion, too many things. Negotiating with the Russians, keeping the situation in the Middle East under control, carrying out massive changes in the United States. There are only so many hours in the day. Much better for him to have focused first on domestic issues, leave Witkoff, who seems a capable man, who understands the Middle East, to take care of things there, and leave Ukraine to take care of itself. That is what I think he ought to have done. Well, he didn't, and we now have this disaster on our hands. Now, the danger is that this whole situation is going to escalate. We're going to get American troops fighting the Houthis in Yemen, and that will be a resumption of the forever wars, because I cannot see how any quick victory against the Houthis can be achieved. Why should it be when everyone else who has fought them has failed to achieve that victory? And if we start getting fighting resume in a big way in Gaza, well, as night follows day, there will be a return to the tensions with Iran that was such an important part of international affairs last year. And, well, I can't see how this helps Donald Trump or his agenda, notwithstanding the undoubtedly visceral dislike for the government of Iran that he obviously has done. I'm going to suggest that as soon as his call with Putin is done, he speak with his people and try to bring the situation in the Middle East under control, scotch these ideas, these dangerous ideas of ground operations in Yemen, and get onto the phone to Netanyahu and tell him to bring the airstrikes against Gaza to an end. Unfortunately, and I have to say this, I have no confidence that these are the things that Donald Trump is going to do. And I suspect that just as Ukraine is now absorbing a huge amount of his time, before long the Middle East will start to do so as well, with a result that focus on the grandiose plan to reshape the economic and institutional structure of the United States will be lost. That, unfortunately, is part of the difficulty with having an individual like Donald Trump try to lead a reform program of the kind that he seems to understand that the United States needs. But there it is. Anyway, I hope that the situation in the Middle East is brought under control. I very much fear not. The ceasefire in Gaza has always been extremely fragile. It could very well be that even if some kind of ceasefire or cessation of hostilities is achieved in the conflict in Ukraine, Donald Trump will have his hands full with the Middle East, and for all I know, perhaps before long, Ukraine will start up all over again also. Anyway, this is where I finish my program today. Just to say that what's happening in the Middle East is a humanitarian disaster as well, which we must never forget. But anyway, this is where I'm going to finish today's program. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop. Don't forget also to check your subscription to this channel and tick the like button if you've liked this video. As I said, we will see in a few hours quite what comes out of this call between Trump and Putin, and well, no doubt we'll be covering it further both on this channel and tomorrow on the Duran. Thank you again. More from me soon. Have a very good day.